This conference will now be recorded.
This is a picture of Stalag Luft 3. And my question is why would anyone want to get away from here? It looks so inviting. This is just a snapshot of what the prisoner of war camps looked like, primarily in Germany, although there were a few in Poland. Now in Poland, what there were concentration camps, and the system was completely different. The POW system was specifically designed for prisoners captured either from the American or British Air Forces or the Russian Army most of the war. And as you can see from this picture, it looks like every time you turned around, there was another POW camp. Later on, I'm going to show you a picture that shows that this doesn't begin to cover the prison camps that the Germans operated. What I did was take a book called The Great Escape, written by a man named Jonathan Vance. Vance is a young man. He was not even alive during World War II, but it is the primary source of my material. It was written in 2019. The first book, the most well-known one, was written by a man named Paul Brickhill. It was written in 1950. Brickhill was actually in that camp, and I'm going to talk a little bit about him later on. He was intended to be one of the escapees, but he did not. There were also several first-person accounts of the Great Escape, and then there was a movie that came out in 1963. This book describes the story of the Great Escape more from the perspective of the people who were involved. And as you read this book, you get the impression that the entire British Air Force was shot down by the Germans, because everybody you read about, of course, was shot down from either a Spitfire or one of the other British airplanes. But it talks about each individual's background, talks about their plane crashes and captures. It is extremely well researched. And there's a lot of information that's available about this escape. Vance himself teaches military history and Canadian history at a school in Western Canada. He is an award-winning author. He's a fairly young man, and if you read the kinds of books that he's written, you'd want to read some more of his stuff. Among other things, what it does is it describes how the entire empire was involved in the war. It wasn't just Great Britain and England, and how the empire developed its resources to support the effort of Great Britain during the war. And most of these people were captured before the United States even entered into the war. And it's really interesting to read about all of the various Air Force sources, but the captured Royal Air Force, Royal Canadian Air Force, Royal New Zealand Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force, and the South African Air Force, all were people who were captured and put into Stalag Luft 3. They viewed their duty in this camp to be singularly escape. That was what they did with their time, and many of them were there as long as 5 years. Stalag Luft 3 was designed specifically to prevent this from happening. And that's what we're going to talk about a lot about, it is this particular prison camp, although there were many others. At the outset of the war, there were very few systems in place to incarcerate POWs in Germany. There were plenty of concentration camps. Concentration camps were from everyone from political dissidents to Jews to communists to whoever it was that the Nazi government didn't care for. But there were not really very many POW camps. One of the first things they did, the Wehrmacht determined that Soviet prisoners were not to receive the protection of the international and customary law. I'm going to talk just a little bit about what happened to the Russian POWs. There were 200,000 British armed forces and 100,000 Americans captured by the Germans in World War II. Fewer than 10% of these POWs died in captivity. That's in Germany. In Japan, the rate of death of POWs was considerably higher than it was in Germany. On the other hand, the Germans captured 5,700,000 Russians, more than half of whom died in captivity. So the better part of 3 million plus Russians died in German POW camps. Now, just for comparison, there were 425,000 Germans interned in the United States. And I did not begin to realize in how many different camps there were. There were 700 different POW camps in the United States, including one at Fort Oglethorpe. In those camps, there were about 2,200 escape attempts. On the other hand, there were 3 million Germans interred in Russia, and approximately 1 million of those died there. I couldn't find anything about deaths of German POWs in the United States. I have a hunch it was fairly small. There were more than 400,000 German military personnel who were actually running these POW camps. There were 1,000 POW camps primarily in Germany. I'm going to show you a map of what that looked like. Now, what was the system for incarcerating POWs? As I said earlier, Germany had multiple concentration camps, but they didn't have the prisoner of war camps until the war started. They were unprepared for the huge number of POWs. And throughout the entire war, they were continuing to build and expand POW facilities. And the camp in particular I'm going to talk about, Stalag Luft 3, was added on to about 5 different times during the war. It continued to expand throughout the war. Germany was signatory to the Geneva Convention. And I'll talk about what the Geneva Convention says about POWs, but Germany treated captured British and American prisoners relatively humanely. Russian prisoners, not so much. Many Allied POW units, and that includes Stalag Luft 3, were rounded out with prisoners from other fronts. Other front is a euphemism for the East Front. Now, this is an interesting piece of information. I did not realize this. The POW system was to be administered by the service equivalent of where the POWs came from. For airmen, the Luftwaffe would administer the facilities. Same thing for the Navy. If there were Navy POWs, they would be operated by the Kriegsmarine, and the Army would be operated by the Wehrmacht. The Gestapo was responsible for the discipline of escapees, but could not be responsible for operating the stalags. So the stalags that we're talking about were actually administered by the Luftwaffe. Now, here's a little bit of information about the Geneva Convention about POWs. POWs are entitled to respect for their lives and moral and physical integrity. They shall be protected and treated humanely without any adverse distinction. Among other things, the International Red Cross provided the POW camps with food, medicine, clothing. That was their main source of supply, other than what the Germans chose to give them, was the Red Cross. The Geneva Convention says that it's forbidden to kill or injure an enemy who surrenders. Prisoners cannot be used as human shields. Captured combatants under the authority of an adverse party are entitled to have respect for their life, dignity, personal rights, and convictions. They shall be protected against all acts of violence and reprisals. POWs who have made good their escape and are recaptured shall not be liable to any punishment because of their previous escape. Germany, Great Britain, the United States, and the Russian Federation all signed these accords in 1929. So that's the external rule that the prisoner of war camps were supposed to be operated under. Now, this is what camps look like on a broader scale in Germany.
George,
Yes.
did the Nazi government sign those?
No. 1929 was the Weimar Republic. You could say that the Nazi government, but the Nazi government, in theory anyway, was the legitimate government of Germany. This is where the various POW camps were located. This is the particular camp that we are going to be talking about. You can see that they are all over the country. And by the way, this is just POW camps. The concentration camps aren't even shown on this. It would absolutely fill that map with dots. They operated 44,000 camps.
Can you hear me, George?
Yes.
Question on that last slide on the Geneva Convention. At what point does a person become a POW? When he hits the ground?
No, when they are
My wife's uncle described, he was the last person out of his aircraft. He described seeing his members of his crew being shot while they were hanging from their parachutes.
And
now, at that point, were they POWs or some other category?
No, they are some other category. It's once they're in control of the enemy combatant.
Okay.
All right, back to this. Germany operated 44,000 camps. 1,000 of those were POW camps. Stalag Luft 3, and that's the one we're going to talk about, opened in April of 1942. It was one of 6 camps operated by the Luftwaffe. Eventually, it had 5 different compounds. Each compound had about 15 huts. Each hut held about 100 POWs. This camp eventually housed 11,000 inmates. You can see here, this is where it was. This is Eastern Germany. Just for example, Berlin is somewhere up in here. So it was quite a bit east of most of the German that we know of. The barracks in Stalag Luft 3, in order to make it escape proof, were raised 24 inches off the ground. In addition, this camp was built on loose sand. That meant that the structural integrity of any tunnel would be poor. Not only that, they put seismograph microphones inside the perimeter of the camp looking for noise of digging. In 1942, the Germans congregated most of their RAF prisoners in this camp, and it was soon overcrowded because they were shooting down a lot of the RAF early in the war.
Hey, George,
Yes,
on that map, was those boundaries after they invaded Poland?
yes.
So that camp is in Czechoslovakia or
Actually, it's in
Poland?
Germany, but it's just north of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Now, how did they administer these camps? Stalag Luft 3, the one we're talking about, had 1,000 guards. However, most of them were either too old for combat duty or they were recovering from wounds. This is not the first line troops of the German Air Force. These are elderly and injured personnel. It had sentry watch towers with mounted searchlights and machine guns. They call these towers Goon Towers. The Goons is the name by which the guards were known. They were also known to shoot first and ask questions later. If anybody remember that first slide, you saw two different sets of wires. If they strayed over that knee-high warning wire and failed to surrender if challenged, they could be shot. They did have in their own minds authority to shoot a person in an attempted escape. It was after there was escape had happened that they could not kill the prisoner. Ferrets is a particular kind of guard who specialized in escape detection. The camp had a sizable number of ferrets. These people did not have guard duties in terms of time and guard posts. They wandered around the camp looking for indications that something fishy was going on. They could enter any place in the camp, in the compound at any time. They could search a hut with no warning whatsoever. And the ferrets were actually the bane of the escapers. Then they had a group that they called Tame Guards. And these are guards who were sympathetic to prisoners. Some of them just turned blind eyes to what was going on, but others actually gave them clandestine supplies. So they got some of the material that they got from guards. They could be paid off with Red Cross parcel information or material. They could be paid off with cigarettes. Some of them did it because they really did not like the Nazis and wanted to support the POWs. So that's the group of people who were administering Stalag Luft 3. There were 1,000 of them on that staff. Now, who was the commandant? Friedrich Wilhelm von Lindener Bieldau. He was a German staff officer, full colonel. He was a full colonel of the Luftwaffe during World War II. As you can see, he was born in 1880, so by the time of the war, he was in his 60s. But in 1914, he had been assigned as the Commander Infantry Staff Guard at the Kaiser's General Field Headquarters. He was one of the Prussian aristocracy. The aristocracy still mattered in Germany, even in the Second World War. Between the wars, he was a staunch German, but he was an anti-Nazi. In 1937, 3 years before the war really heated up, he was on Goering's personal staff. He was the commandant of Stalag Luft 3. After the escape, he was removed from that position and court-martialed. He feigned mental illness to avoid imprisonment, and he was not imprisoned by the Nazis. However, he was imprisoned for 2 years after the war by the British, even though he did adhere to the Geneva Convention. And I couldn't find out exactly what they convicted him of. Perhaps it was just ill treatment of the prisoners. He spent 2 years in in a British prison. This I thought you might be interested in. It's the escape organization of this prison camp. It was organized as soon as the camp opened. They started with an escape committee, and I mean, they had a hierarchical organization that probably looked pretty doggone imposing on a spreadsheet. But the escape committee made all decisions about who could escape, who could do what kind of escaping activities. They could either say, yes, we like what they're doing, or no, you can't do that. They had ultimate authority over everybody else in the camp. Then there was an intelligence section. And the intelligence section responsibility really was getting information about the outlying parts outside the camp. Because if you escape from the camp and you don't know where you are and where you're going, you don't have a prayer. So they had a subcommittee for intelligence. Then they had a subcommittee specifically designed to make maps. They made 3,000 maps for the escape. And reading about how they made these maps is just fascinating. It was a sophisticated, very, very well organized, well operated organization. Then they had a group whose role was tailoring. And their role was to take uniforms and convert them into civvies, or take uniforms and convert them into German uniforms. The tailoring activity was also extremely sophisticated. And this was all being done by hand. There weren't any sewing machines. I don't know where they got bolts of cloth and whatever they worked with. Some of it came from the guards, but they could convert a uniform and make it look like something, or at least somewhat like a civilian outfit. Then there was the tunneling activity, the most sophisticated tunneling operation I've ever read about. I'm going to talk a bit more about what the tunnelers did, but they were extremely well engineered, well designed, well built escape mechanisms. Then there were the forgers. The forgers' role was to provide for the escapee papers, letters, cover material, authorization to be in a given place at a given point in time. The forgery operation was also incredibly sophisticated. They even made these stamps to put on these forged documents that made them look official. And then last and not least, if you escape from this camp, you're going to have food. And so there was a nourishment subcommittee. And their role was, depending on where a person was going to go, provide them with enough food to sustain them for an indefinite period of time while they were out. And as you can see, that organization, in just one of the 5 compounds on Stalag Luft 3, and that was a British compound, had 600 different people doing different things within that organization. How they kept all that secret, how they kept that all clear. Like I said, you had to have a pretty good organization chart to know who was doing what and where they were doing it. Now, in the meantime, Stalag Luft was getting overcrowded. And so they transferred some RAF officers to Oflag 21B, which was in Poland. They were there because there was overcrowding in Stalag Luft 3. In November, even more RAF officers came there from Stalag Luft 3. They were shooting down a lot of British airplanes. You get the impression from reading the book that the whole RAF was shot down by the Germans. This group, as soon as they got to this other camp, immediately started trying to escape. They built a tunnel below the latrine here. How they did that, and there's a fair amount of information in the book about how they did that. 35 men escaped from 21B through that tunnel. That included 2 people I'm going to talk about later, Harry Day and Billy Ash. None of them reached neutral territory. So in March of 1943, one of the preludes to the Great Escape was this escape from Oflag 21. All 35 were captured. However, there was one prisoner who reached Danzig from this POW camp. He was on a work detail, and he escaped from the work detail and got away from the Germans. And there's a fair amount of information about his trip, and I didn't spend much time on that. In April of 43, the camp was cleared of all POWs. By then, they had enlarged Stalag Luft 3, and they were all sent back to that POW camp. Now, I want to talk about leadership of this organization. Wing Commander Harry Day was a Royal Marine in World War I. You can see that by the Second World War, he was a relatively old man. He was in his early 40s. He was later an RAF pilot. He flew a Bristol Blenheim and was shot down. He was moved to 3 different stalags. This guy, read about him if you're interested in just a fascinating middle-aged man. He was moved from camp to camp because every time he went to a camp, he immediately started trying to escape. He was the senior British officer in a number of camps, including Stalag 3, and a persistent escapee. I think I read he escaped 7 times during the war. Together with another man I'm going to talk about named Roger Busho, he planned and organized the Great Escape. On 24 March 1944, Day and 75 others escaped in the Great Escape. He got as far as Stettin. Stettin is on the Baltic. All he had to do was get on a ship and he was free. He was captured in Stettin. Whoops, what happened here? He was slated to be executed for the Great Escape. Goering relented on his execution. He was sent to Sachsenhausen. Sachsenhausen was...
Your slides disappeared.
You can't see it now?
Nope.
Really?
Everything disappeared.
Huh?
Yep.
Oh, for God's sake.
Really?
No, no, we can't see it.
There you
Now we
are.
can.
Okay. He was slated to be executed, but Goring did not decide to execute him in particular. He was sent to Sachsenhausen. He escaped again. He was recaptured again. At the very end of the war, he escaped one last time and actually got away from the Germans. The man who was actually what they called Mr. X was a man named Roger Busho. He was a squadron leader. He was born in South Africa, but a military aviator in the RAF. He was a commander of a fighter squadron in October of 39. His promotion to squadron leader was confirmed in 1940. On patrol near Calais, he was supporting the Dunkirk evacuation. He shot down or damaged 2 BF-110s and then was shot down himself. He crash landed his Spitfire on German-occupied ground and was captured. He is best known as the mastermind of the Great Escape. He was known as Big X. He was one of the men recaptured and subsequently murdered by the Gestapo. And how they chose which of these people to kill isn't real clear. They had criteria. And certainly being Big X was one of the criteria. They didn't want him back in the camp. Once the British were back in Stalag Luft 3, they started construction on 3 different tunnels. Tom, Harry, and Dick. And I don't see Dick on this. But the first thing they did was engineer them. I mean, these were not just let's dig a hole in the ground and head out. These were, here's Tom and here's Dick. I'm sorry. Here's Tom and here's Dick. They engineered these tunnels extremely carefully. First, they started with an initial chamber and a vertical shaft. So you had to go down before you even started going laterally. Air handling was a serious concern. Some of these tunnels were quite long, and if you were out at the end of the tunnel and the air out there was not breathable, you were not going to do well. They built a rail system inside the tunnel. The rail system was built initially to haul dirt back and forth, but then also that's the method that they used when they went out. They went out on these rails. There was an electrical system. They hooked these tunnels into the camp wiring system, and they had lights down here underground. The biggest single problem was how do you shore up these tunnels? Because remember, this was sand, this was not clay, certainly not stable material. So they needed a great deal of wood to build these tunnels. And then finally, and not least, they had to disperse 100 tons of soil. That was a major challenge. You see the word penguin? What you would do is if you were not involved in the tunnel itself, but you were involved in the dispersal, you would get soil put in a bag up your leg. You'd walk out into the compound, unloosen the bag, and let sand be dispersed throughout the camp. In that fashion, they actually dispersed 100 tons of soil. Now, if you'll remember the character on the motorcycle, his name was William Ash. He was not in The Great Escape. He was an American Spitfire pilot. He became the inspiration for McQueen's character in The Great Escape. He was called the Cooler King. By the way, there were no Americans in The Great Escape. Before the U.S. entered the war, he joined the RCAF. He even renounced his American citizenship. He flew Spitfires. His career came to an abrupt end when he was shot down by FW-190s. He spent the rest of the war being shuttled among various POW camps. He was in 7 different camps. He planned many, many personal escapes. He even attempted something they called mole tunneling. And in a mole tunnel, what you do is you get underground, and as you dig forward, you take the dirt from where you're digging forward and put it behind you. That was one of his types of tunneling expertise. He was sentenced to solitary confinement so many times, he was called the Cooler King. He was not in The Great Escape because he was in the cooler at the time. There was another escape called the De-Lousing Escape. The camp had a hygiene issue with lice, and they regularly took prisoners off post to delouse them. An escape plan that was masterminded by Busho in June of '43. 24 officers who were escorted by fake guards who were POWs in German uniforms, left the camp through the main gate to proceed to be deloused. These escorts, holsters, pistols, and uniforms, gate passes were all indications of what the escape committee was capable of doing. All 26 escapees were recaptured, many within hours. 24 of them were returned to that camp, but 2 were sent to Oflag 4 and Cold Ditch. And this is where I think they got the story about the Garner character. They were trying to steal an airplane and they got caught. And so they were not, I don't think they actually got off the ground, but that's what they were trying to do. So you could see that the Great Escape actually kind of took information from many different activities. Cold Ditch was a 1,000-year-old fortress in the heart of the Reich. It was 400 miles from any frontier. Its walls were 7 feet thick. It was on a cliff with a sheer drop of 250 feet. It took prisoners in November of 39 and became a high security prison for those regarded as escape writs. However, a number of them did escape. 16 people escaped from Cold Ditch and got back to the British lines. Its population was approximately 250 by the start of 1945, primarily Commonwealth and American prisoners. Its most famous prisoner was Douglas Bader. I'm sure some of you have heard of him. He was the Spitfire pilot, had artificial legs. He made so many attempts to escape that they threatened to take away his artificial legs. Now, another warm-up for the Great Escape. I think this is fascinating. The first successful escape from Stalag Luft 3 occurred in October of 43 in the East Compound. They constructed a vaulting horse from plywood that they got out of Red Cross parcels. This is what the vaulting horse looked like. It was a gymnastic activity. The horse was designed to conceal men, tools, and containers of soil. Each day the horse was carried out to the same spot near the perimeter while prisoners were conducting gymnastic exercises above. Below, these prisoners were digging a tunnel. At the end of each working day, the tunnel diggers would place a board over the tunnel entrance and cover it with surface soil, and the horse would be taken back into the building. It disguised the purpose of the vaulting horse, kept the sound, because of all the gymnastic activity, kept the sound of the digging from being detected. For 3 months, 3 prisoners in shifts of 1 or 2 dug 100 feet of tunnel. They poked through the surface to create air holes. They successfully, these 3, reached Allied territory. Now, the main tunnels, back to Tom, Dick, and Harry. Tom began in a corner next to a chimney in Hut 123. It was found by the Germans and dynamited. I thought you might find the next piece of information kind of interesting. It was the 98th tunnel to be discovered in the camp. Dick's interest was hidden in a drain sump in the washroom and had the most secure trap door. However, Dick was abandoned for escape purposes because the area where it was going to be surfaced outside the wire had just been cleared for camp expansion. As a result, what they did was they used Dick to store soil and supplies, and actually as a workshop. Harry, which began in Hut 104, went actually under the German administration area, the sick hut and isolation cells, that's the cooler, to emerge in the woods on the northern edge of the camp. The entrance to Harry was hidden under a stove. This is what Harry looks like in a schematic. You go down, remember what I said about this getting down to an area? 30 feet before you even start thinking about moving laterally. And then you start digging. This is Harry to get outside the wire, 310 feet. The engineering, the whole operation is just hard to imagine in hindsight. Now, the Great Escape itself, it begins. Harry was ready in March of 1944. They had originally intended to do it during the summer, but in early 1944, the Gestapo visited the camp and ordered increased effort to detect escapes. Several German guards, openly anti-Nazi, gave the prisoners items and assistance in any kind they needed to aid their escape. 600 men had worked on the escape effort, but only 200 were going to be able to get out. The first group of 100, who were mostly serial offenders, these were people who had escaped before and been captured, were guaranteed a place in the escape. The second group, with less chance of success, was chosen by drawing lots. They waited about a week for a moonless night, and on 24 March, the attempt began, and the ground was covered very heavily with snow. That becomes a real issue for the escapees. The escape itself, and this is a reconstruction of what Hut 104 looked like, and here's the reconstruction of Harry that's currently part of the monument at the camp. Almost immediately, an air raid caused the camp and the tunnel's electric system to be shut down. That was the first serious problem with the escape. At around 1 a.m., 3 feet of Harry collapsed. Sideboards had to be repaired. That further delayed the escape. Despite these problems, 76 men crawled through to freedom. Their transit of the tunnel is a story all by itself. Ropes broke, trolleys derailed, blanket rolls that people were carrying got wedged this tunnel is 2 by 2, by the way, but 76 men got through. The escapees started dispersing in many directions, but they were, by the time they even started to get out, an hour and a half behind schedule. And that was a real serious problem because part of the schedule was to catch trains from a nearby town called Sagan, and they were behind schedule. The railroad station became a major congestion point. Trains had been delayed by the air raids, and it was literally chock full of escapees. Recapture followed fairly quickly. At 4:55 a.m., the 76th through the 79th men were spotted emerging by a guard, and they were detained. The escape was stopped. Those in progress, and there were people down inside the tunnel when this happened, they had to turn around and get back out of the tunnel. And that in itself is another story. The guards had no idea where the tunnel entrance was located. They had dogs. The dogs were sniffing around, could not find the tunnel entrance. However, what happened was a guard went down into the tunnel, crawled through the tunnel, and was trapped. He called for help, and the prisoners up in Hut 104 let him out. A number of the almost escapees went to the cooler. Quickly, the cooler filled up. At the same time, a general alert was spread throughout all of occupied Germany. Of the 76 escapees of the Great Escape, 73 were captured, singly and in pairs over the following weeks, most of them in the first week. Sometimes they were actually captured by civilians. policemen, home guard. A fair number of Germans turned them in who were not German soldiers. The snow itself was a serious problem. When this happened, Hitler wanted every recaptured officer to be shot. There were 3 who got away. One named Brand van der Stok, he was a Dutchman. He had been a Spitfire pilot. He was an ace. He crossed much of occupied Europe to reach neutral Spain. He was one of only 3 of the 76 to reach Great Britain. He traveled by train to Dresden, then he went to Holland, then he went to Belgium, and in Belgium he met other fugitives, and he was conveyed all the way through France to the Pyrenees and into Spain. He was on the road, and I've seen a map of his transit for 3.5 months before he reached safety. There were also 2 Norwegians who also managed to reach neutral Sweden. They traveled by train, remember Stettin, via Frankfurt, traveling as Norwegian workmen. They met some Swedish sailors in a brothel, and this brothel was supposed to be a congregation point for escapees. They knew about the brothel. They said they could meet Swedish sailors there who would then put them on a ship, smuggle them on a ship to neutral Sweden. After the escapees were recaptured. Now, I thought you might be interested, and this is only a partial list. This is what they used to build these tunnels. 4,000 bed boards, 90 bunk beds, 600 mattresses, bed covers, pillowcases, tables, chairs, benches, lamps, water cans, and 300 meters of electrical wiring were all missing when the Germans inventoried what the TO&E of the camp was supposed to have. Hitler wanted recaptured officers shot, but a few people told him that violated the Geneva Convention. They also told him if you shoot these airmen, they're liable to start shooting German airmen that they have captured. Hitler then insisted that more than half were to be shot. 50 were executed singly or in pairs by the Gestapo for resisting arrest. Roger Busho, who was the leader of the escape, was shot by the Gestapo. Harry Day, who was also a leader, was not. And I'm not sure I know why Harry Day was not, except that Goering gave him some grace. 17 escapees were returned to the camp. 2 were sent to Colditz, and 4 were sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, including Day, who was sent there, who proceeded to escape again. The end. On 27 January, with Soviet troops only 26 kilometers away, the remaining 11,000 POWs were marched out of the camp. January, on foot, 30 pounds underweight. South Compound prisoners plus 200 men from the West Compound were sent by train to Stalag 7 at Moosburg. The remaining prisoners were sent to Stalag 13 and on to Stalag 7A. Built to hold 14,000 POWs, Stalag 7A, which is in Bavaria, now held 130,000 POWs. They were freed in late April of 1945. You might be interested in this. The British were not complacent about what was done to their prisoners of war. They set up a tribunal almost like what the Jews set up to hunt down the people who did these executions. 15 of the executioners were captured, convicted, and executed. Some others were captured even later and served long prison sentences. So it didn't end in 1945. The British followed up after the war. Conclusions. Books and movies often exaggerate a story to make it interesting, but sometimes they miss the heart of it. The Great Escape was actually more than one story and far bigger than the story it told of the escape itself. The RAF and the U.S. Army Air Corps had many successes, but they paid for their success. Studying this POW data, go back to the very beginning, you see how significant the war in Russia was in the Second World War. The magnitude of the war in Russia is just overwhelming. Reading about battles and strategies, we overlook the human aspect of war. And this book really does a good job of telling you about all of these individual people, a lot about their individual lives. He must have done an amazing amount of research, like the 50 who were executed for the Great Escape. I thought it was an interesting companion to the Bomber Mafia. Any questions?
Yeah, George, you were talking about the British tribunal. That was before the Nuremberg trials, right?
No, it was not. They went on in parallel.
Oh, they did.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was a whole different. You know, there were several different Nuremberg trials, by the way. There's the one that we know most about, but the Russians also tried a number of Germans. So this particular activity was guided specifically by the Brits, and they had hunters looking for these various individuals. A number of the people that they executed were Gestapo goons. They did not get very many of the upper crust because the upper crust were being taken care of elsewhere. The man who led the entire, call it execution operation, his name was Arthur Nebbe, and he was one of the people who tried to assassinate Hitler, for which he was then put in Sachsenhausen. And he was executed by the Germans before the war even ended. Hello?
I was going to mention just one thing about the movie that I had learned. You had spoken about the guard who spotted the 76th and 79th prisoner escaping from the tunnel.
Yes.
That guard in the movie was actually a prisoner of war in America, in Missouri. He was a German, but in a POW camp in Missouri, and he actually escaped from the Missouri prison and was caught at a train station in St. Louis. So they actually made him part of the movie just to kind of have some juxtaposition of the whole scenario. Yeah.
Small world, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Hey, George, how did the Red Cross get supplies to these prison camps? How did that work?
It was a complete organized system. The International Red Cross in Switzerland, and I assume they were funded from various allied organizations. They would get material, they would box it, they would ship it to these POW camps. Realize there were 1,100 POW camps. Their primary content was food, but they also had clothing, they had medicine. They provided a number of things to protect POWs. The average prisoner of war lost 30 pounds during their incarceration.
Did the Germans let all those supplies through, or did they peel off part for themselves? Because they were looking for food and all that during that time, I think, weren't they?
I wouldn't be surprised if they did some of that, but by and large, it went through. I don't have any way of knowing how much of it turned out to be in somebody's pocket along the way.
Well, that's probably a story in itself, how they whoever did that, you know?
You bet.
Without it, those guys would have starved to death, I think.
They were, technically, they were supposed to be fed 1,400 calories a day. In practice, it was probably quite a bit less than that.
I bet that in the Russian side of it, there wasn't a Red Cross feeding the prisoners, you know?
I don't think, I've never heard anything about the Russian POW camps, but I wouldn't be surprised if they had nothing to do with it. The Germans decided before the war even began, they were going to treat the Russians differently. They were not going to let the Geneva Convention constrain them with respect to the Russians.
Thanks for those insights.
You're welcome.
George, I had the opportunity to meet a guy who was an American captain who was shot down. And he arrived at this same camp at or just after the escape. And basically, all he could talk about was how terrible the march was when they got moved from camp to camp in January.
Oh, yeah.
He talked about that more than anything else, was how miserable it was.
Out on the road in January, already weak, already sick, 10, 15 degrees, snow.
Oh, yeah.
It was awful.
That was his worst memory of the whole ordeal.
I can believe that.
For instance, he didn't remember even bailing out of the B-17.
Yeah.
George, how many people died of malnutrition or disease at the camps?
There weren't any statistics that I could find. What I did find was less than 10% died, period. So less than 30,000 of the 300,000 Americans and subjects died. And I don't know how many of them died from what. It's still a pretty good sized number. But in Japan, it was a lot worse. The Japanese were not as their POWs were quite a bit different than what the Germans were.
Well, a totally different culture, I think, and that the Germans, for all their bad sides, probably had the same ethics in their society as existed in the American and the British society. You know, the basically the same ethical system existed in Germany, whereas in Japan, it was a totally different situation where prisoners were considered to be really terrible people for having surrendered.
Yeah.
They were considered to be less than human.
If you read the book, Willard, and read about how they were individually captured, a lot of them were captured by farmers. They weren't all captured by the Wehrmacht or even the Gestapo. They were captured by the Home Guard.
Right.
So the population was still supporting the Nazis.
Oh, yeah.
As these people were trying to disperse throughout the country.
Oh, for sure.
It is a very, very interesting book, and I would encourage anybody who wants to read more detail. That book, there are actually 4 different books that I know of. The first one was written by a man named Brickhill. He's the one that wrote the book that the movie was made on. Brickhill was supposed to be in the escape. He went down into the tunnel and he said, I can't handle the claustrophobia. He came back out of the tunnel and gave his spot to somebody else. He was not part of the escape itself. He was supposed to be. Well, guys,